Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Poverty Narrative, Confronting Inequity series, dedicated to a deeper understanding of the connections between structural racism and poverty in the U.S. This is our third session of the day, Confronting Inequity in Education. We have one more session after this, and we hope you'll join us. I'm Patrick Cooney, the Assistant Director of Economic Mobility at Poverty Solutions, and a former middle school math teacher. Our goal over the course of this event is to promote in-depth and solutions-oriented media coverage of the connections between structural racism and poverty. And for this session, again, particularly focused on education. In this session, we'll talk about inequity in K12 education. The COVID-19 pandemic has put America's public education systems to the test. As schools adapt to online learning and reimagine classroom environments, how can they avoid replicating existing inequities in our education systems? Helping us answer these questions, we have three great panelists. Camille Wilson, University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor of Educational Foundations, Leadership and Policy at the University of Michigan. Her research explores the intersections of school, family, community engagement, urban educational reform, and transformative leadership. Matt Barnum, a national reporter covering education policy and research at Chalkbeat, a leading education news organization. And Bonnie Billups, the Executive Director of Peace Neighborhood Center in Ann Arbor, a neighborhood nonprofit that has provided virtual learning support during the pandemic for students whose families have low incomes. Before we dig into the conversation, I want to remind our viewers that we want to hear from you. You can submit questions in the comment box to the right on YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag PovertyNarrative. We look forward to having a meaningful conversation, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We welcome an open and respectful dialogue and want to let folks know we will be responsive to any inappropriate content. In addition to hearing from our great panelists, one of the goals of this event is to build a network of academics, researchers, practitioners, and journalists. I invite you to check out our resources, tune in for additional events, and find other ways to connect with other poverty researchers and journalists at our website, poverty.umich.edu. So with that, thank you, Professor Wilson, Mr. Barnum, Mr. Billups, for joining today. I wanted to start by just giving each of you a chance to talk about your work. And if you feel it's appropriate, feel free to also share sort of what has been kind of top of mind for you as you've seen the education world navigate the pandemic and seeing kind of inequities heightened through the pandemic. Professor Wilson, can we start with you?
Sure. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. So yes, I'm Camille Wilson. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan in the School of Education, as was mentioned. So very broadly, I'm interested in issues of school, family, community engagement as they relate to educational policy and reform. And I have worked both in schools and in community spaces to think about the most equitable ways to engage and empower, particularly families of color, mostly families with low incomes. So I've done that in a variety of ways. In schools, I have looked at the roles of school-based leaders, principals, administrators, also teacher leaders, to be inclusive, to be culturally responsive, to be very progressive in building relationships with families and embracing families from a strength-based orientation, also working to confront their own bias around race, class, and so forth. So I've looked at that work and considered good structures, strategies, relationships in schools that affirm diverse families. Most recently, probably for the past 9 years, I have really shifted somewhat to be community-based in my work and be very collaborative with community organizers, with nonprofit leaders and civil rights organizations, and so forth, and thinking about issues related to school reform. And I'm very interested in understanding, supporting, validating how youth and family members are also educational leaders, particularly in their role as community advocates and activists for education. So for instance, I've had a 4-year partnership with community organizers in Detroit, mainly family members and youth, working towards school improvement initiatives in the city and in the state of Michigan. And I'm very interested around activism and advocacy at that grassroots level, how families of color and families impacted by poverty strive to promote the change they want and they need, and put their voices out into the civic arena for themselves. And this means organizing, lobbying, legislators, educating their neighbors and community members. So I'm very, very interested in that work. So in addition, I have a current collaboration with a civil rights organization in Detroit called Focus Hope. And we are working together along with a colleague of mine at Wayne State University to think about ways to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. And as I may speak to a little bit later, that's also something very relevant with the pandemic, as kids are out of school, particularly children of color, particularly children impacted by poverty. We are also seeing the ways that some of them are surveilled more in their homes and punished for that. So it still remains an important issue. So overall, I think about families and community members' role in improving schools. And it's really important to me to not just see the value of legislators and administrators' role in changing schools, but thinking about bottom-up, grassroots level work to improve schools as well. As part of this effort, I recently founded a research center here in the School of Education at the University of Michigan. It's called the CREATE Center, and it stands for Community-Based Research on Equity, Activism, and Transformative Education. So overall, it's the center is dedicated to bringing university researchers together with community advocates and activists, and thinking about how we can collaborate to either leverage research for the sake of improving and protecting public education, or actually collaborate together and conduct research for those purposes as well. So there are strands of my work that also relate to action research, where I do collaborate with community members and they are part of the research process too. And that's very meaningful to me. And I also, with the center, help support other folks interested in doing that as well, collaborating, fostering collaboration amongst university folks and community folks to do research. So that's some about me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Camille. Matt, could you go next?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. So I'm a reporter with Chalkbeat, an education news site. I cover policy, politics, and often research related to schools. And so obviously the last year I've been covering the impacts of COVID on schools, and that has taken up the lion's share of my attention, of course. And part of that has included discussion about school opening and how and whether school buildings should open. So one thing that I've covered very carefully is the disparities in where schools are or are not opening their buildings. And we're seeing very consistent evidence. And I think actually some of my colleagues at Chalkbeat were the first to really document this pattern. We're seeing very consistent evidence that schools and school districts that serve more students of color are less likely to reopen their buildings. And there's very good reason to be concerned about that. we have a lot of reason to think that in-person instruction is better for kids than virtual instruction. And we already have very serious disparities in our education system based on race and socioeconomic status. And there's every reason to think that this pandemic has exacerbated those disparities, both in terms of the effects in schools and the effects with families. And that's really concerning. And, I've been documenting those facts in terms of, the quantifiable evidence, and including student test scores and course pass rates. We're seeing, alarming rises in the share of students who are failing courses in high school. But there is, one other important point that I think gets missed here. And that's, if you look at polls of families, and I think actually this is jumps out from some of Camille's comments about listening to parents and families. If you look at polls from families, families of color are, on average, and that's an important point, but on average, families of color are much more reluctant to send their kids back into school buildings. And that's presumably because of the pandemic's disproportionate effects on families and communities of color, and also historical lack of trust in school districts and school institutions. But that's a really important point in the sense of, many families are not, especially families of color, are not looking for their school districts to open. They're looking for high quality virtual instruction. And I think that is one of the key reasons why many school districts disproportionately serving families of color have stayed closed. Now, there are still many who think those schools should reopen, including some of the families of color who are in those schools. And so it's important not to paint with such a broad brush. But that has really, I say that because that has really been the focus of a lot of my colleagues' coverage in the last several months, especially because this has been such a significant political and, of course, substantive issue. Another thing I've really been covering is school budgets. And, as we all know, we're in the midst of something of an economic downturn. And after the pandemic hit and there were lockdowns, there was widespread concerns that school budgets would be in deep trouble. And there were particular concerns about our highest poverty districts and districts that serve the most students of color, for sort of wonky reasons about how those schools tend to be funded and because of longstanding disparities in school funding. And what is notable is that the school budget situation hasn't been nearly as bad as many feared. And if the proposed stimulus, which is $1.9 trillion and $130 billion for schools, passes, about $130 billion for schools, if that passes, I actually think a lot of schools in this country are going to have a great deal of money to invest. And the way that the stimulus is being proposed presently, the money will disproportionately flow to the highest poverty schools, to those schools that have probably been most affected by the pandemic. Potentially, upwards of several $1,000s per student, which is a huge amount, which is not to say that that's not warranted, but it is to say that there's going to be a very high stakes situation of schools are going to have a lot of money to invest. And the question is, are they going to be able to invest it effectively in a way that helps students who have suffered because of this pandemic? And, for what it's worth right now, I cover education research a lot. I should say in the past tense, that was much of my focus before the pandemic. I've been covering research less now, less than I would like. But I've covered a lot of research on the effects of school funding on student outcomes. And there's a lot of recent research that suggests that, yes, money does matter, and spending more money on schools helps students do better academically. And there's some evidence that that's particularly true for low-income students. And so there is reason to be optimistic that these sorts of investments will pay off. But I think that's still, an open question when and if the stimulus passes. But that is a good news in the sense of school budgets. People were very concerned that there were going to be deep cuts. And I think, if the stimulus passes, many districts, relatively few districts, if any, will face cuts in and many of them will have money to invest. The last comment I'll make, particularly considering the theme of this conference, is I think this pandemic has really shown the interplay between poverty and education. And I think there has been in the past a simplistic narrative of, the only way to fix poverty is to improve education. And I think what this pandemic has shown, and I think it's, been shown and been argued by many people and many scholars before this, but that poverty and the effects of out-of-school factors, in this case, both, poverty and, the effects of the pandemic can affect directly students' educations. And we've seen this in terms of access to technology. I think it is the biggest one. I've covered some research on the effects of a very simple anti-poverty strategy, and that involves sending money to families, to low-income families with children, so that they're no longer poor, making low-income families not as low-income as they otherwise would be. And it turns out there's a lot of research that suggests that leads to direct academic benefits for their children when those children's parents get more money to invest so that they're not hungry, or so they're well sheltered, or invest in their education as well. That sending money to parents improves their test scores. It might improve their attendance. It might improve their high school graduation, their chances of graduating high school. And there is a proposal in the current stimulus package to expand the child tax credit or the child benefit system, which currently excludes the lowest income families in this country. And estimates suggest that that could substantially cut the child poverty rate in this country, which by some measures is one of the highest in the world. And so my last comment is just that, that is obviously a big deal and very notable just from a societal poverty perspective. It's also very notable from an educational perspective.
Thanks for that, Matt. That was great context. And, I think we're going to try and dig in a little bit more to the intersection between poverty and education a little later in the program. And, just it should be noted, our faculty director of Poverty Solutions, Luke Schaefer, has been really active for a long time in the child tax credit expansion work. So that's a proposal near and dear to our hearts for sure. Bonnie, could you go ahead and talk a little bit about your work?
Sure. I'm Bonnie Billups. I'm the executive director of Peace Neighborhood Center here in Ann Arbor. Peace has been an organization that's been around for almost 50 years. As a matter of fact, this year we're celebrating our 50th year, with programs and services that wrap around families, that assist people to break social and economic obstacles, and allow families and individuals to find their greatness and to become self-sufficient. We do that with a variety of programs and services, but on a very grassroots level, working with families and working with kids. The largest part of what we do is working with young people, kindergarten or pre-K, all the way up into kids who are in our college prep program, a college and career prep program, using education and job skills as a way to break cycles of poverty. On March 13th, when everything sort of closed down here for the school district, we sort of, like everybody else, tried to figure out what we were going to do. And for 2 weeks, we sort of met over Zoom and thought about all the things that we could do. But right away, what made us very aware was the fact that we were going to have a bigger hole in the safety net, a bigger hole in the safety net for kids and families that we served. And what could we do to help with on the education piece, on the education, economic, food, mental health piece, to be able to shore up and make sure that those holes weren't as large. We knew that we're still going to have families who are going to be disproportionately affected by the pandemic, but we wanted to reduce the amount, if we could, of stress on families. One of the things that we did was right away looked at the families and the young people who we knew would not have the resources and the support to be able to make this transition to virtual education. The first transition that happened here in Ann Arbor was basically, we don't know what we're going to do. Here's some computers, kids get online, and from April to June, I will say not a lot got done. It was, here's some assignments. We're still trying to figure it out. And we were the connection with families who we serve to make sure that we could get internet resources, technology together, but then seeing kids right away in person to support this synchronous learning support that kids needed. By the time the summer rolled around, the school district had a summer learning program, and we figured we would change our whole summer camp programs, which basically serve about 180 kids throughout the summer at our 3 different centers. Serve those kids by buses and vans going out and doing experiential learning stuff, activities all day, food, were mobile camps. We knew that couldn't happen because of the pandemic. We couldn't have 3 kids in the bus seat, and all stacked on top of each other and us going to have fun. That wouldn't happen. So we decided we would support virtual learning with the summer school program. And we did that. And we were one of the only community centers who was able to pull that off. We pulled it off. And we completed a 6-page document to the school district saying, these are the things we noticed right away that are going to be problems. Inequities that we see, assumptions that teachers are making, issues that we have a problem with that are making the holes in the net larger for kids who we serve. Kids who are the majority, but not all, Black and brown, and impoverished, but not all. By the time the school year rolled around, we knew that we had to support an in-person synchronous and asynchronous program. So we started by doing synchronous support, and we eventually have moved into doing synchronous and asynchronous support 4 or 5 days a week with young people, over 140 kids that we're seeing in our 3 centers weekly that we're supporting with this education piece. So that's where we're at. That's where we're at right now. That's what we're doing, along with, of course, all the other things that came up with the pandemic, right? In June, we saw an increased need for mental health support. The amount of families who we had who were feeling, who had depression and anxiety and depression around us being together all the time, around economic situations. How am I going to pay my rent? Over the fact that we had a tremendous amount of parents who had lost their jobs or who had to lose their jobs or had to quit their jobs because of childcare, right? School, for a lot of people, their work schedule is based around their kids being in school, and that's part of their childcare plan. So if you're a mom or you're a dad, now you have 4 kids or 5 kids who are now out of school, and someone needs to be there to take care of them. The only option for a lot of families was to quit their jobs, to be able to provide the support while their kids were in virtual learning. So I'll stop there, and I know there'll be plenty of other questions and plenty of other things that we'll all talk about, but I'll stop there for now.
Great. Thanks so much, Bonnie. Yeah, we're definitely going to, I think, dig into the things that you've been seeing sort of on the ground as these months have gone on. So thanks again to all of you and for the work that you're doing. We're now going to jump into a couple of questions for the group on the pandemic and how it's it's sort of impacted existing educational inequities, and then as well as some questions about the relationship between journalism, academia, and community-based organizations. And then at the end, we're gonna make sure we have some time to take some questions from the audience as well. I want to start with a question. This is open for anyone to take, where I think the conversation around education, for better or worse, often starts, and that's testing. So, standardized testing has always surfaced complex racial dynamics. I think proponents hold up testing as a way to identify race and income gaps in academic achievement, enabling necessary reform, while opponents claim that tests end up just simply masking structural inequities in a range of other areas, but by race and class. But they have racially biased content. They lead to inferior teaching and learning in the classroom when it's all focused around standardized tests in high poverty schools in particular. Some suggest that COVID has placed a spotlight on our use of standardized tests, not only altering their use during the pandemic, but potentially going forward, a sort of rethink of how we use standardized tests. How have you seen COVID impacting the standardized testing regime in the U.S.? And how do you see this playing out going forward? And do you see any kind of positive or negative developments?
I'm happy to take the first stab on this, since I've written about it. I'll mostly focus my comments on descriptively what happens rather than weigh in one way or another. But last school year, standardized testing, federally required standardized testing, which happens in grades 3 through 8 every single year as a matter of federal law, were waived for the first time since No Child Left Behind, because the pandemic shut down school buildings in the middle of March, right when testing was about to happen, and it was just not feasible. Many people were hoping that was going to happen again, that there would be another waiver of testing, particularly because although some students are back in school buildings, many are still learning fully virtually, and standardized tests generally are designed to be conducted in person. That didn't happen. Just a week and a half ago, or maybe last week actually, the Biden administration announced no, they would not be waiving testing this year. And that was very frustrating to a lot of people who generally are critical of standardized testing, don't think they are good measures of student learning, and especially during the pandemic, they were concerned this is not a good use of time, and this isn't going to yield valid data because many students are still not going to take it, and perhaps the students who, especially who have lost the most learning, may be the least likely to sit for the exam. On the other hand, some civil rights groups and some congressional Democrats who are very concerned about equity have made the strongest case for testing. Their argument is we need to test this year to figure out what sort of learning loss or missed learning students have experienced because of the pandemic. And because of that, we're going to be able to figure out to measure these gaps and target resources for the people who need it most. And so that's, those are the terms of the debate. There's still a question of, some states are still actually trying to get out of the regular standardized testing this year, even though the federal government has pretty clearly suggested that they will not let them get out of it. Michigan is actually one of those states who have indicated that they're still looking for some wiggle room. In the future, I think it's unclear whether this is going to change anything. Testing is in federal law right now, and so and that really shapes a lot of aspects of education policy. So you'd really have to change federal law. I think some critics of testing are hoping that doing the test during the pandemic is going to lead to a groundswell of criticism from parents and families and teachers, and saying the testing isn't worth it. Let's get rid of that in the long term. But I think we're going to have to wait and see if they're successful.
So I can pick up with some thoughts. I didn't weigh in earlier about your question related to what keeps us up at night since the pandemic. And I'll say, two things and then link it to the standardized testing issues. One is thinking about families in the ways that Mr. Phillips described, like what stress, is just crashing upon children and families right now. And so much of the discourse in education is around learning loss. However, we have to be thinking about the mental and emotional health of children right now. And for so many, it's devastating. And particularly for children impacted by poverty, who are disproportionately children of color, right? So that is a deep concern to me as an educator, as a researcher, also as a parent. At the same time, the other issue is before COVID, the other issue keeping me up at night was the extent to which public education as a whole is under threat, particularly for children of color in schools that pre-pandemic were already targeted for closure. And part of the reason why they were targeted for closure is because of the emphasis on low standardized test scores, without attention to how various factors connected to systemic racism have habitually under-resourced schools in communities impacted by poverty. So egregiously under-resourced those schools. So therefore not positioning educators and students well to learn overall, learn holistically, let alone perform well on standardized tests. So I'm really concerned that now certain school communities are more threatened, more vulnerable than ever, because even with some stimulus funds, they won't be able to counteract the wealth and influence of upper income families who are exiting public education right now, or have the funds to have very well-resourced learning pods for their families, or compensate in some other ways that children and families impacted by poverty cannot. And so I think this idea of testing and using that as baseline data right now to get a sense of where kids are at, that's maybe one of the only ethical uses of test scores right now. At the same time, if that's what is done, we also have to think about what it means for a child to be under duress and stress right now, anxiety, to be told, we're also going to assess you, we're also going to test you in the midst of everything that you're juggling at home with your families, and also in trying to keep up with schooling. So I'm concerned that it's going to be misused, and also just be an extra layer of stress on children and families, and then therefore weaponized to close and further disenfranchise some really vulnerable public school systems.
Thanks to both of you. I think that's a great. Those were great points on highlighting a lot of the various kind of dynamics at play. And I'd love to actually kind of carry on from what both of you said. I think that both of you hinted at the idea that a lot of the gaps that we're currently talking about, a lot of the gaps that currently gets referenced about during the pandemic, have to do with this idea of learning loss. And Bonnie and Camille both highlighted the fact that there are a lot of other gaps going on, be it mental health and stress and anxiety, be it broader kind of disinvesting in public education. So I'm curious if we could kind of expand on that idea for a little bit. I'm wondering, kind of, there's been a lot written and talked about how the pandemic has been magnifying kind of these pre-existing inequities that Camille was just talking about by race and class in education. I'm interested in kind of going beyond simply talking about learning loss. Because I think that stuff's been pretty well covered. What are other things that you all have seen in your work of the inequities that may be popping up that may not be the ones that are sort of top of mind for a lot of people? What are the inequities that you're seeing that go beyond simply kind of talking about learning loss or test scores?
Inequities of economics and of the ability to support your young people financially, to inequities of, I had a kid in my office who was didn't want to ever turn on his camera at home, just because that inequity of his bedroom compared to his friends who were in class could now be visually seen, right? The inequity that he was sleeping on a mattress on the floor and not a bed, those kind of things. But I think that we've had a tremendous amount of parents who've had to leave their jobs, who've had to move in order to support their young people educationally, or to have daycare. People who've maintained their job but their kids are now living with grandparents 4 or 5 days a week because of the work schedule. So, the whole thing of summer loss has always been there, and we've all been trying to address that. I think this loss is greater. So what keeps me up at night? One of the things is, to our school district and other school districts, what are we going to do to address this whole year of loss? What are we going to change when kids get back into the buildings to really address that? Because this whole year has been a struggle for pretty much every family that I know, no matter what economic level you're at, but of course, disproportionately for kids and families who are poor. And how are we going to address that? That's a question that keeps me up and keeps me trying to figure out how we as a social service agency and how we can push our school district to make sure that this is at the front of what they should be thinking about.
I would just add, I'm a data research focused person. I love writing about that, and I love being able to quantify things. And a lot of the conversation has focused on quantifiable learning loss, failing grades, economic loss, and that's well and good. But I think one thing that is really important not to forget is the inequity and the effects on just experiences. One of my colleagues wrote a story recently about the lost season of sports for many kids in New York City. And, playing high school sports is a really important part of kids' experience. I remember playing high school sports, and those are just memories that I have. And that's something that kids are not going to be able to get back. Learning loss is something theoretically we can make up, that kids can get back. Whether that will happen, we'll see. But the loss of experience, which almost certainly has been deeply inequitable in terms of schools being closed, including the loss of experience of just being in school and making friends and building meaningful relationships with your peers and teachers. That is something we shouldn't miss. Just because we can't quantify it doesn't mean it's not real. And, I think that is quite tragic.
Great, thanks everybody. I had one other question that I want to make sure I get to a few from the audience that I wanted to direct towards Camille. You talked about how your work focuses a lot on kind of community empowerment and sort of driving school reform through a community-based lens and working with families and communities. And I think I'm sort of wondering if you sort of hinted at it in your answer before, but I'm wondering if there are sort of core ways in which the priorities that you end up seeing that communities and families are pushing for, how those end up being different than the reforms being pushed by other actors, government, school system leaders, philanthropy.
Sure. Yes. So the comments that have been shared really reflect the difference, right? So when families speak and advocate for themselves, they emphasize their lives and their needs holistically in the ways that we all are, right? They talk about the need for safety, for care, for supports, for integrated services, for recreation, right? And not test scores. So very, very much, we have the disconnect with traditionally policymakers honing in on the test scores, honing in on the quantifiable, and families and children being much more holistic in terms of thinking about the pieces of the whole pie, the emotional, mental, economic, and most definitely, the nitty-gritty learning, the academic. So that's a key difference. And even thinking just a few minutes ago and listening to Matt, Yes, what's also not quantifiable is trauma, right? And so as we talk about loss, I think we should be talking about trauma at the same time. And so definitely there's a year of whole loss, like what was said, and that's intersected with trauma for many families and many students. And so when I hear from families, when I collaborate with them, they are starting from a place of frustration, from worry, given the harsh impacts, and also given their wisdom about how this is structurally inequitable, in some ways by design in the society. And so they're, it's an uphill battle to advocate for themselves, to try and better educate policymakers and more fluent citizens who have a great deal of influence politically about their plight, and to have people look at this issue of academics, of educational impact in the fuller way that I think we are all grappling with in this space.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. I want to take a couple questions from the audience. This first one is directed to Bonnie, and I think it's sort of down in the weeds of what community organizations and nonprofits have struggled with during the pandemic. I'm sure there's a lot of people who work or run those organizations in the audience. So this question asks specifically about kind of your expenses during COVID. So kind of how has the organization been able to sort of weather the storm throughout COVID? Is your funding sort of keeping pace? What % of your funding is private, and kind of how has all that looked throughout the pandemic in terms of sustainably funding community-based organizations?
Yeah, we're an organization that 65%, 70% of our budget or revenues come from individuals and small family foundations, not a lot of the governmental. And the fact that probably the largest component of all of our youth services is our ability to use volunteers. That stopped on the 13th of March last year. We have had, and we just started instituting limited amount of volunteers into our protocol over the last month or so. So that's an increase of staff, right? That's an increase of staff hours. So all the initiatives of seeing kids every day, of seeing 140 kids every week right now, is all based upon my staff, my workers. Increased hours. Some of my young people who would be away at school, who are now doing virtual learning because their college campuses are shut down, who normally work for us in the summer, have been working for us year round now. We definitely had a larger expense in the area of staff costs, where we've had some reductions, of course, have been on things like some of our food and some of our transportation. Our vans and buses are not on the road as much. We're not purchasing as much food because we partnered with the school district, where the school district is supporting food in the community. So some of those things have definitely been a yin and yang of how we've been able to make it. What we did find was right away, people were very concerned about others. And I can't speak for other nonprofits, but we had a tremendous outpouring of support in this community of people saying, and maybe it's because of the history of Peace Neighborhood Center and the grassroots efforts that we do, but people saying, here's my stimulus check. I don't need it. My family doesn't need it. Let me give it to you guys to help somebody else. There were grants that were made available from the United Way, Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation, the state, and other sources that specifically came to us to target people of color and people who were being affected by the pandemic. So where we've had some loss, we've had some gain, and we had a pretty good year financially to be able to maintain and to do what we've done. the plan is moving forward. The problem is moving forward. Can we continue at this pace, not only emotionally for the kids and staff, but financially? Can we continue? We're hoping that we will be able to till we get back to some sense of whatever the new normal will be when kids go back to school, and we can reconfigure back to what we did pre-pandemic. So.
Thanks, Bonnie. That's great context. That's great to know. I know a lot of folks are concerned with how organizations are kind of getting through the pandemic. So that's great to hear. I have one more for the group, and then I know we want to get to a few questions specifically around the interaction of academia and journalism and community-based organizations. There's a second one from the audience asked specifically about higher education inequity. So the question is, has any of your work looked at the impact of the pandemic on inequity in higher education? And if not, do you have any observations? Is there anything that we can kind of take from your work that can apply to higher ed?
Guessing that's for me. So I haven't, I'm a K12 researcher, so I haven't approached that issue from a researcher perspective. However, I live it, right? Because I'm also an educator and I teach. And so I would say that the similar issues to what we've spoken to when it comes to children and families, we see that reverberate with older students. We know and we feel and experience every day in higher education that our students too are many of them are very devastated right now and juggling so much to hold it together. And some of them are on the other side. Some of them are parents or have ill or elderly parents. We've had students affected by multiple deaths, students who have had COVID and recovered from COVID themselves, right? So we have the adults who are grappling with the pandemic, and also with our students of color, and those who also come to the university from backgrounds impacted by poverty. We have some of the things that we've mentioned here, the crisis for food, for housing, for internet access to continue on with their studies, things like that. So the university has had to really corral itself to think about, how to provide services in different ways for those who are acutely impacted by the pandemic. So yeah, I mean, that's what I know and experience, fielding and doing my best to support students who come to me and voice what they are juggling right now and struggling with, while also really wanting to persist in their academic programs.
I can talk anecdotal about some of this. I mean, we have young people who are in our college career prep program who we want to go away because we know that the opportunity for them to be successful at the college level is by them not living at home. And when school shut down and went virtual, all of them are back home, right? And they're struggling with quiet places to work. So our offices and centers have been open for those kids in our programs to be able to come here and actually do their virtual classes from a quiet space because their siblings are also online. Now, some of them have been able to model good behavior with their siblings, but sometimes if you got 3 or 4 siblings and you are already on top of each other, there really is no place for you to try to be successful as a college student. And so us providing that space has been something that has helped.
Thanks, Bonnie. And Matt, it looks like you want to jump in as well. Is there anything you've seen sort of in your reporting on how the inequities in K-12 have kind of carried on into inequities in higher education as it relates to the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm very concerned about is access to high school counselors who can help students make the transition to college, to help them get through the battery of obstacles in applying to, accepting, enrolling, paying for college. We have some very good evidence that college counselors, high school counselors make a difference for students, and particularly for low-income students of color. And I'm worried that it's going to be hard to, it has proven difficult to replicate that virtually. You know, I talked to a high school counselor recently, and her job was to make sure high school students were filling out all the forms that they needed to for college. And she said, my best tool was I could walk down the hallway, go to the kids' class where I knew they were, pull them out of class and sit with them and make them fill out the forms. And she doesn't have that anymore. You know, she has to call them or email them or text message them. And, you know, I think there had been some hope in this field that we could replicate the effects of school counselors through very low cost interventions, through text messages that nudge kids, fill out the FAFSA, or through packets that we sent in the mail that gave them lots of information. You know, we've gotten a lot of recent evidence that shows those really don't work nearly as well as many hoped. And in fact, they may not work at all. And so what that has suggested to me is that the human in-person aspect of this is really crucial in getting kids to and through college.
Can I jump in with that? Because Matt, Camille, I'm sorry. You want to say something first?
Yes, but just briefly. Given what you shared before and also what Matt just said, I wanted to throw in another bit, which is related to isolation. Right. So as you spoke to, for the younger students, the college students, most definitely, there's a lot of things they're juggling in their home space, and like their home of origin may not be the best space for them to be in. There's also older students who live alone, or just have an interesting roommate situation. So what we also have is isolation right now. And that is contributing to the stress, to some of the trauma, to depression, and the practical barriers to serving students the way we want to be serving them. So I just wanted to name that as a factor right now.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry, Bonnie, do you have something quick to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to just say, the institution of the school district, of the school, is more than just a teacher, that a kid has multiple touch points of people who support them. It's the teacher, it's the bus driver who says, have a great day, that kids have a relationship. It's the cafeteria supervisor, it's the janitor in the building, it's the school psychologist, it's the school social worker, the counselor, all those people. And kids don't have that part of their safety net right now. They're just seeing a teacher on the screen working through Zoom or whatever other mechanism of virtual classroom is happening. And of course, there's breakout rooms and other things, but that feeling of that support, of you having somebody that you could go to who would have your back, adds to the fact of stress with young people, the fact that that's not there. So.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I know it's definitely the sort of face-to-face necessity of so much they have in education is definitely been a light has been shown on that throughout the pandemic. I think we'll have time for at least one more question, maybe a couple more. But I really wanted to focus now, I think, pivot to the relationship between journalists and academics, and how the two sort of complement each other's work. These will, I think, probably be largely directed to Matt and Camille. But Bonnie, I think we might be interested in your thoughts as well on kind of how academics and journalists can interact with community-based organizations. I think from Matt, I think we'd be interested to know kind of, in covering education research and policy, you obviously interact with a lot of academic research. In your mind, are there things that academics could be doing better to help journalists improve the public's understanding of poverty and education issues?
Yes. So I think the first thing I would say, and hopefully probably most academics realize this, but this is definitely not a thing when you write a study, like if you write it, they will come or they will cover it. Not true at all. Journalists probably, if you publish a study in a peer-reviewed paper, journalists will not see it in all likelihood. And if they do see it, they won't read it. And if they do read it, they won't understand it. So it's really difficult to get at those to make those peer-reviewed articles on their own get covered. And I think developing to be very succinct, developing relationships with journalists, sharing your work directly with journalists you respect by just dropping a simple note and saying, I have this new study out. If you're interested, I'm happy to talk more. And then writing versions of academic work that are accessible. I love when there's a journal article that's 30 pages long, and then there's also like an executive summary, and the abstract doesn't count. Like an executive summary that's 2 pages and has readable, understandable graphs that describe what you did and what you found in accessible language, and that can really go a long way.
That's great, man. Yeah, that rings true. The bread and butter of the Poverty Solutions work is the 5-page policy brief. That might even be too long for you. I'm not, so I don't want to. But
no, 5 is good.
I definitely. I think that's a great point. Camille, I'd love to hear both your response and if you could just a quick comment. We only have a couple minutes left. A quick comment on what you'd love to see kind of more coverage of that's coming out of academia.
So what Matt shared, I understand, and and I'm conscious of, and actually I've thought about the policy brief, keep working to translate the research. I like the executive summary idea, so I'm taking that away, not the abstract. But for me, what I would like to see, I usually get contacted for 2 different things. One, given the work that I've done in Detroit, is to offer some perspective on the educational scene and complexity of Detroit schools, right? Which I'm happy to do. And as I do that, I always strive to also offer points of hope and agency and effort of families and students, and not just like feed into some really problematic all doom and gloom narratives of not just Detroit, but urban schools and schools of color. So also though, I am particularly excited when I have the opportunity to talk about the advocacy and activism of families and communities. So I have been able to do that more recently. And I think what I would like to see is that ask, contacting academics, researchers, to have us offer some examples of effectiveness, of goodness, of effort, and not just the commentary on the problems, right? Or offer us some opening to bring in that balance and to point to some possibilities, right? So like Peace Neighborhood, right? So there's problems, but then there's also wonderful practice, and that should be making it into the media too, because also the public wants to know, what can we do, right? Yeah. And so the more that academics and media can work together to offer solutions and answer the questions, what can we do? I think that would be great.
Thanks so much, Camille. Yeah, the solutions-based journalism is definitely, I think, a very kind of promising practice going forward for sure. I know Matt looked like he wanted to jump in too, but unfortunately we're out of time. Thank you all so much, Professor Wilson, Matt, Bonnie. Thanks so much for your thoughts and participating today. You've done exactly what we hoped, sort of in highlighting so many issues around inequity that the pandemic has surfaced that may not make the front page. And thank you for all of you that tuned in and participated on YouTube. We really appreciate your insightful contributions and questions. The final session starts in 30 minutes, and we hope you'll join us. You can visit poverty.umich.edu after today for videos of all the sessions and additional resources. Matt, Camille, Bonnie, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.